All right, we are back live, AJC and the Web Devs with Dev Agrawal, or Dave, technically. It's really good to hang
Both
out with you,
work.
man. We haven't talked much this year, but you came to my wedding, which was awesome. So I
Yeah,
very much appreciated that, and I've been wanting to kind of reconnect and see what you're up to these days. So you want to like introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know you, the few people out in the web dev world.
definitely. Yeah. I'm a full stack JavaScript developer. I've been building JavaScript apps for about 7 or 8 years now, something like that. Um, most like my experience is like pretty much all over the place, but it's primarily been the full stack. I never really inclined I'm only building front ends or I'm only building back ends. So it's kind of a interesting direction that my career has gone into because of that. And obviously, like everything that I'm doing recently has been informed a lot of by that experience of mine, which was like just fully building full stack apps forever. Um, yeah, I work at Smart Data as a software engineer. I make YouTube videos sometimes. I post a lot on Twitter. Um, Trying to do some like open source stuff recently. Not very good at it, but it's trying.
I think you do some pretty cool open source stuff. I think just being someone who is like out there kind of always engaging in the conversation, that's something I did a lot more in like 2021, 2022, and started to fall off in 2023 and didn't do much in 2024. But I think those are like, it's just so valuable because people get to kind of see like the conversations and how people think about these things, because everyone has hot takes and opinions, but you actually like take the time to write out your thoughts in a very coherent way. And
Most
got
of
like
them.
retweeted
Here's
by
my cat's tail.
Oh, hey, what's up, Kat? Yeah, you were retweeted by Evan Yu, who was like, this is a good take on React Server components, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, it caused a pretty big jump in my followers. Thanks to him.
Yeah, so what are the topics that are like interesting to you when you do you feel that you kind of check the vibe of what the conversation is, or do you try and drive the conversation?
I think it's mostly the first, like just try to check the vibe, try to like kind of try to form my own thoughts and offer like some sort of insight into what I can see what I can see going on. Very few times it's actually like trying to drive conversation or trying to generate new conversation, because like I feel like there's a bunch of people doing a much better job at that. And the best way to drive a conversation is not really just like make a tweet about it. It's more like you build something that clearly like you build something, put it out there, something fully formed, either like a like high effort YouTube video or a product or an open source project, something like that. And that's how you really drive the conversation. That's something that I'm trying to do, but it's not something I'm very good at.
Yeah, it's almost like the framework authors to a huge extent drive the conversation just by the code they write. But then you also have people like Ryan Carniato, who does both. He like drives the conversation about building the stuff, and then he's constantly trying to explain why he's building the stuff and the direction he's trying to go. And you're super involved in the Solid community, and it sounds like you won big for the Solid hack.
Yeah,
you should talk about that. What was your project? So actually, first, just what was the Solid Hackathon? Because some people probably saw, some people probably didn't, and it was a pretty substantial one from what I was looking at.
Yeah, so they try to do it almost every year, I think, but I don't think they did it last year. So this is the first Solid hack after 2022. What's up, Nick? Sure, yes. How's it going? Nice to see people popping up. Yeah. Yeah, so they, I mean, it's a hackathon to try to grow the ecosystem, to try to motivate people to learn Solid, to build something with it, to show off its cool capabilities. And obviously, Netlify and Sentry were the two big sponsors, because Netlify is where Ryan used to work, and Sentry is where he works now. So two pretty big sponsors, lots of money flowing in, and lots of excitement around like SolidStart, which was recently released. So it was also kind of a way to get a lot more people to be building stuff with SolidStart or for SolidStart, and grow the ecosystem, get it, because at this point, like everyone that talks about Solid or Svelte online says that, okay, these are clearly better frameworks, but React's ecosystem is bigger, so I'm going to use that. Like it's like ecosystem is kind of the only thing keep like holding the React mindshare together at this point, it seems like. So
because it's the network effects. Like there's a real argument to why that makes sense, because you end up with the most people building stuff, and then you get the whole community stuff. And Solid and Svelte both always have this problem of, how do we have all these extra libraries that do all the crap that people expect from React libraries? And so you kind of did something that really added something substantial, which is like real-time capabilities, essentially. So was this something that SolidStart didn't have, or did it have it and you made it nicer? Like, what exactly did you do?
It's something that no framework has. It's like every framework has kind of went into this direction of like stateless. We're just going to do HTTP. We don't care about
just stick it in a lambda.
Yeah, exactly. And like doing WebSockets with AWS Lambda is like a whole category of pain, which is why like people probably don't want to build like any sort of agnostic layer around it. Like most people just wanted to put their apps on stateless servers so that they can run it as much as they can. And if the framework comes with a limitation that you can only use this framework on a long-lived persistent server, that immediately hurts adoption, right? So no, every framework has been very, very scared of doing any sort of like real-time things. Even Next.js, which like has a platform team behind it, they're not really going in this direction. And I didn't like that. I was like, a lot of people need to build real-time apps. We're just making it more difficult for them to build these kind of apps. Sure, we have the services like Ably, Pusher, LiveBlocks that are doing some great work here. But what if I want to actually run code on that server? Why does that have to be a separate service that now there's a latency between my server and their servers and my client? Like it's like you can always build better things, or like better apps, more efficient apps, if you just have control of the logic that runs on those servers. And then PartyKit happened, which is like, okay, this is exactly what I wanted.
Sunil's like Cloudflare, or he left Cloudflare to build that, right?
Yeah, because they wouldn't let him build inside Cloudflare for some reason, and then later they realized their mistake and acquired him. So
that's like the ultimate hacker move. You're like, if they won't let me build it, I go build somewhere else and then force them to buy it. That's awesome.
Yeah, baller move. Yeah, that's basically what happened, and that kind of like, in a sense, showed me that okay, the direction that I'm thinking actually can work. And then the other thing that happened was I looked at things like LiveView.js or Phoenix LiveView, which are doing some pretty good work in advancing the DX of how you build real-time things. So it made sense that, okay, this is like, if we were to build real-time apps, it's not going to be like Socket.io, which was great for its time. I had a great experience with Socket.io, but like clearly we need to evolve past that. And then server components, server functions happen, which is like, now the boundary between client server is completely gone. It's compiler takes care of it. You write a string, you write a function wrapper, and it's there. So like, why can we not take this idea of the boundary being gone, or the boundary being a compiler directive, and apply it to real time? So that's basically been the premise of like all the work, trying to explore how this might look like, how this might work.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because what you're saying about, the stateless app architecture being really predominant, and you mentioned like Vercel and Next, and Socket.io was Guillermo Rauch.
Yeah,
kind of went away from that and was like, I'm going to do these Lambda things. And with Redwood, it was really interesting because I learned kind of through seeing the progression of the framework, like the issues with just sticking it in a Lambda, because the whole thing was built to be stuck in a Lambda. The idea was Tom was like, oh, in 3 years, Lambda will be 10 times faster and you could do 1,000 concurrent requests. Like he just thought that it was just going to get better and better and better every year. And then it kind of just didn't. And that was really tough. But then they were like, okay, what if we just ran this in like a PM2 node server? So it was technically real time, but it was really just taking a Lambda and running it all the time on a server. It wasn't really WebSocket, because one of the oldest forum posts we ever had was, how do you implement real time in WebSockets? And since it was GraphQL, you had this whole subscription thing as well. So it was always like, oh, once we have GraphQL subscriptions, we'll have real time. And then the GraphQL subscriptions were like, actually, we're not going to do subscriptions. We're going to do this other weird GraphQL thing that live queries, or I don't even remember what it's called, but there was something that competed with subscriptions. So then we had to decide which of the two to use. And it was just a whole confusing thing. So I definitely get what you're saying, how it's not really built into most frameworks. It's always been kind of like, well, you just roll it your own with your own production app. But it's built into the platform, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And the other thing that was interesting there is that with things like server components, or server functions even, it kind of became obvious that there's a bunch of additional complexity that we add on just to make, just to be able to communicate between a client and server. But with function and components, it's just a function marked. Like you don't need any extra concepts here. You just need a function marked with a directive. And it was something similar that hit me, which is that we already have ways to manage state. We have stateful components, we have signals, we have all these state management libraries.
We have databases also.
We have databases. But then just to make WebSockets work, we now have to learn one new thing, which is just how to communicate using just messages, and then build a layer between compatibility layer between that and our existing state management. And then another one on the server that takes these messages, talks to a database, and then talks in messages again. So we're kind of plugging these 3 or 4 systems together instead of just using the one reactivity system that we are already familiar with. So that's another approach that I'm trying to.
Would you be cool screen sharing actually and showing the code for your project?
Sure, yeah.
Because I could go into it, but I would be able I wouldn't know what to really look at. So I'm sure you've probably done demos of it already.
Yeah, I should have done that earlier. Give me a second.
Go for it. But and you won a crap load of money. So that's what I think is pretty cool, is that you were recognized for building something super useful. Because that's the point of a hackathon. Ideally, you're creating something that's not just cool that you can show off as something that's actually useful to someone somewhere. And I think it's cool that instead of just being like, oh, have everyone build a bunch of dashboards or something, you built actually a useful library, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, the hackathon had 2 different categories, one for apps built with Solid, and one for ecosystem libraries.
Okay. That's really smart. Yeah,
there's definitely so there's definitely just apps.
You won $7,000, right?
Yeah. So that was for the ecosystem.
I'm assuming that's
category.
public.
It is, yeah. It's on their website.
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off. What were you saying?
Yeah, no, I was just saying there is an app category where you will see a lot of those random apps built out over a weekend or something. But there's also really good ones Chris Griffin. He spent a lot of time on stream just building out this code diff tool.
Nice. Yeah, when I saw it announced, I thought about it, but I was traveling for the first 10 days of November and could not even code for 6 of those. So I was like, not really gonna have the time to do it as well as I would want to. Can I share your screen?
Yeah, let's do that. So I'm gonna just fix this up a bit. So this is a simple example of a counter. It's very straightforward. You have a signal, and you have an increment and decrement functions. Like it's a custom hook that you might build for like React or Solid, anything like that. But by annotating it with useSocket, now this runs on a server, which means this piece of state lives on the server, these functions live on the server, and what you return from here, like all of this is server code, but it can be called from the client. So I don't think I have an example for this, but if I can just go in here and
to do app is fine. Yeah.
Yeah, to do app is a bit more like work going on there. So instead, I'm just going to do this. My counter is use counter, which gets imported from like I'm literally importing it in a client file, calling it, and then here I can say, oops, not caps, button on click. Let's say what counter dot increment, and then it's going to show count, which is counter dot count. Like it's literally as simple as that. And I can try to run it. I hope nothing is broken. But basically, like this, the value of this count now comes from the server over WebSockets. When you click the button, like we sent a message to the server saying, hey, please run the increment function, which will increment the count, and it will immediately update the signal on the server, which will update the signal on the client.
Okay. So obviously this is inspired by, to some extent, React server components because you're doing the use socket.
Yeah.
I haven't used SolidStart since it was in beta like a year and a half ago. Are there any other like quote use blank things, or are you the first one to like do this?
So
like for Solid specifically.
For Solid specifically, there is I don't think there's any for Solid specifically. Obviously, there's use server, which is in SolidStart, which is what like this is inspired out of mostly. I mean, obviously, use server in Solid comes from Next.
Right, that's what I was asking. Is like, does SolidStart have server components already, like a use server? Okay.
Yeah, it does have server functions, so that you mark with use server, and that's kind of like in a lot of my conversation recently on Twitter, which is that server functions have now become kind of like a framework agnostic concepts. Like they originated in SolidStart, actually. They were not use server string directive, it was a function wrapper. But they originated in SolidStart as a function wrapper. Very quickly adopted that. And then Next.js and like with the app directory, they adopted a different version of it, which used the string directive, the use server. But it was, again, basically the same concept with a couple more things added on. Then from there, like Solid also like started or kind of grabbed onto the string directive instead of function wrapper. CanStackStart still uses a function wrapper instead of a string because they can add a lot more capabilities on top of it. Quick, I believe, is also still just a function wrapper. So, but the point is that server functions as a concept now kind of exist. Like they're out there. Any framework can use it. Every framework should adopt it probably. I know there's some framework authors who kind of don't like it. Rich Harris has spoken out against it very explicitly. Yeah,
so
Blink was like, yeah, Swell like separates it into a separate file with loaders and actions. So they don't have server functions. I hope they will at some point.
Okay,
or you can just build a Swell framework that has it.
We need to just ambiguate some of these terms. Yeah. What's the difference between a loader and a server function?
So a loader is specifically a server function, or not a server function, a function that you would use to fetch data and or specifically fetch data outside of your components, most likely at some sort of a routing event. So a loader is something that would fetch data. It would be something that your router is aware of, which means your loaders can be called as soon as you navigate into a page, instead of like in between rendering. So it's kind of like a loader as a concept specifically exists to prevent client-server waterfalls, to help you load data in an optimal way. Server functions is just the capability to invoke some logic on the server by like sending an HTTP request. But what you're writing is just that function with the directive. So it can fetch data, it can mutate data, it can do something else. Server function doesn't imply how you use it. It's just the mechanism that you write a function and at runtime it becomes an HTTP request and the code is not sent to the client. So you can combine those concepts, a loader and a server function, so that you have optimal data fetching and you're fetching on the server instead of on the client. And same thing with an action. So like an action would be something
mutation usually, right?
Yeah, an action is a mutation. Like that's the first kind of property, and the second property is that it when an action completes, any loaders that like all the loaders or any some specific loaders are going to read on and give you the updated data. So that's what an action is. And again, you can combine an action with a server function to make a server action.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I remember when my first job was at StepSend, this GraphQL company. And at the time, this was beginning of 2021. So this was like Remix had been around for less than a year. SvelteKit had been around for like 3 months, I think. And so the way everyone just did GraphQL is like you would just like hit it from your client and just like query it. But with StepSend, it was a managed GraphQL API. You had an API key, so you'd have to do your call on the server, but there weren't a lot of good ways to do that at the time beyond just sticking it in like a Lambda function and then hooking that up to your framework. And then I remember when loaders started coming out with like Remix and SvelteKit, it was really nice. I'm like, oh, now there's this thing, and now all of my StepSend examples are now simple as hell because I just use the loader, you know?
Yeah, so a lot of frameworks kind of combine the two concepts, like loader and this ability to just write a server function. So a lot like Remix and SvelteKit, the loaders by default are on the server, so they don't really have concepts of a client loader. Remix does. It's literally called the client loader, but like some frameworks
will kind of like, why would you need one? You could just do a fetch on the client, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you would still need one for the same reasons, like if you don't want to run a JavaScript server, or like if you have a different, like you don't want to pay for a JavaScript server at all, you only want to run on the client side, you're talking to an external API, or you have a separate server like Go or Rust or .NET, Java, something, and you just want to talk to that one instead of running your own servers, then you might need the client version of them. But yeah, so most of these meta frameworks kind of combine both. So you also have a server, and the loader by default runs on the server. Loader and action both. I think SvelteKit must have a way to say that these loaders. It has both. Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Yeah. I'm not really super familiar with SvelteKit.
Yeah, and then you've got like Astro has now a lot of this kind of stuff as well. They have a whole bunch of crap that can run on the server in different ways. And I guess like obviously you did the Solid Hack thing, but if you're just building, greenfield apps in your spare time or whatever, is that what you would reach for? Or there are other frameworks? Like what are some of your go-tos these days?
Yeah, no, SolidStart is my go-to these days, 100%. I just gave a talk last month called Meet the Web Framework from the Future.
Oh, that's
kind of
great.
A provocative title, but yeah, obviously it was about SolidStart. I don't think there's a recording up there yet. I don't think there's gonna be, because that conference, like, they don't really publicize recordings.
An ephemeral I did record event only the initiates got to see.
Yeah, I did record my in-person talk, but it was like such a quick, because I designed the talk to be 50 minutes, but it was only a 25-minute talk. So I had to rush through it. So there is a recording that I can post, but it's not great because I had to rush through a lot of stuff and I had to skip through a lot of stuff as well. So I might just like record it separately on my own and then But if I'm recording it on my own, do I just want it to be a slideshow, or do I want to make it more high effort? I don't know. It's kind of like I should just record it. Like there's no reason for me to. It's fully prepared and it should be out there. But it's 100% my go-to. I built a conference app recently, or I've been building it for like since last year. But I initially built it in Next.js and then I ported it over to SolidStart, and the experience has been like much better compared to when I was building it with Next.js.
Remind me what the name of that was. I remember this.
I think I just called it Velocity, but that's kind of like an internal code name. It's just called the Momentum app, like app.momentum.com. It's like for attendees to look at the schedule, bookmark things, give feedback. And then like this year, I added a lot of newer features, like for speakers to like assign themselves to sessions and like to give feedback specific. And like some attendee networking to scan QR codes, kind of like LinkedIn. So yeah, SolidStart has been much better experience than pretty much anything else, because of like their focus on client side and not moving everything to the server. Like it's like it's like league. Like I'm using Remix at work right now, and it's not the same. Remix is a lot more painful.
Interesting. Yeah, the answer will be slightly different, I'm sure, for these two, but I would be curious if someone was like, I'm just going to use Next.js or I'm just going to use Remix kind of person, how would you make the pitch to like use SolidStart instead?
I mean, I think the more difficult part of the pitch is how like moving from React to Solid. That's really the more important one. Like if someone is using Next.js and Remix, they probably just want to use React. But if they're open to using Solid, then I would say that, first of all, Solid actually focuses, like it keeps the client-centric model instead of server-centric of Next.js and Remix. Like server components are really nice with Next.js, but it's like, yeah, Remix is very restrictive in terms of data fetching. Like all the data has to go through the loaders, and then you have to like make sure you pass it through either with props or context, and it makes your components like kind of brittle. Like they have to be used in the correct route, or they have to be always passed in the data that they need. You have to always make sure the data is fetched. So yeah, it's very restrictive in that sense. Next.js, I like server components, but not enough. Like there's some very weird pains around using server components around, like if suddenly you need, like they both suffer kind of the same issue where suddenly if you're in a component down in your tree and you need to fetch some data, you now have to make sure you go all the way back up, like to the route level, and make sure like everything is a server component in one case, or all the data comes from the loader and is passed down. So they both have this, less composition ability. Solid kind of retains that by allowing you to like actually fetch inside in your components, and then very easily just like on your route level say that, hey, prefetch this data because I know I'm going to need it down the tree. So I like that a lot about Solid.
I found that really funny what you were saying about Remix, because I feel like this was basically just marketing hype. But when it came out, everyone was always saying it's just using web APIs and like you don't have to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. But what you're saying is the opposite. That actually requires you to learn the Remix conventions, and that if you don't use the Remix conventions in the specific way they were designed, then your stuff gets all messed up.
Yeah, and it's also that using the web API doesn't necessarily mean that move everything to the route. Like Solid also uses the web API in the same way, and so does Next at this point. Which is like using the web API is just that you're using the web standard request response objects.
API. There's like multiple web APIs.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Like the web API just kind of specifically talks about WinterCG or like the like whatever the browser JavaScript standards are. So
yeah, because I would consider like the fetch API is a web API. That's like how I would think about it,
Yeah, and the request response objects that you'll see in the MDN, like, do you use those? Like, obviously, like even in SolidStart, you can get the standard request object. You can return a standard response object. Those work. You can use a form with an action, like method equals post. Action is a server action, and you just post it directly. So all of that still works in SolidStart, whatever like web APIs that you want to use in Remix. And most of them work in Next.js as well. I think so. Yeah. So the web API argument, like, yeah, you won. Everyone's using web APIs now. Now what?
And I think what Nikki is saying is true, that Remix is going to become like React Router with a Vite plugin.
Yeah. So this is another kind of like thing that a lot of frameworks have been going through. And by a lot, I mean two specifically, both SolidStart and Remix, which is what belongs in the router and what belongs in the bundler. Because like the framework is essentially like three things. It's the router, it's the bundler, and it's the server, right? It's also like the renderer, but like every framework has kind of made their choice. Like I'm either using React or I'm using Solid. But like everything else has kind of been trying to wrangle like what lives where, so that they can like clearly find separations. And like Vite's new release, Vite 6 with Environment API, it comes a lot from this same tension of what should live in the bundler, what should live on the server or on the router. So yeah. So yeah, in terms of React Router, their version of this is basically a lot of these features come into React Router, and then there's just a React Router Vite plugin. It's not even the Remix Vite plugin. The React Router Vite plugin that gives you access to server rendering and server data fetching, things like that. And without that, you just have a regular, or you'd probably have a Vite. You would probably use Vite anyways. It's just a Vite plugin that you can use to configure, like, do you want to run on the server or not?
Right. So it's just leveraging stuff that Vite has already built.
Yeah. It's a router with extra steps, and those extra steps. Yeah, and those extra steps are like the bundling plugins and the server runtime.
Yeah, no, this is a similar thing. It's just because my frame of reference is always Redwood, because I followed it for years at a time. And man, when Vite first came out, there's a lot of hype around it. But the whole framework was built around like Webpack and Babel, and Vite
every framework
really,
was.
Yeah, every framework was. Yeah, totally. But it was done in a way that was leverage those tools in like an old school, I'm a JavaScript dev and I'm gonna like write this huge ridiculous Babel config and Webpack file. And like the whole framework is going to be in that Webpack file. It's not just like it was using Webpack. It was like Webpack was and Babel together. And I always had the hardest time disambiguating those two tools, because they were always used together. And it was never clear to me which one was doing which. And then you got Vite, and it was like, oh, we're not going to use either of those anymore. And it's like, well, okay, so do we like rewrite the whole freaking framework, or do we try and
basically
keep most of the framework the same and tack Vite to do things it wasn't really supposed to do? And it kind of ended up being this process that took like, I don't know, like 2 to 3 years,
Yeah.
Snowpack was so cool. Asher was so deep. Yeah, and so this is another interesting historical branch, is that Snowpack now was the first thing that a lot of frameworks were building on. Then Vite kind of came around and was like, we're like Snowpack, but better. And we're like, oh yeah, it is better. Even the Snowpack creators are like, oh, this actually is better. We just using Snowpack now.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, at the same time, Vite also empowered a lot of people who didn't want to build frameworks to start building frameworks, or to make it much easier to build them. So yeah.
I love Vite. I think Vite is probably the most important JavaScript tool that came out since I like started development, because like I got into development around like 2018 to 2020. So the mid 2010s framework landscape had already kind of calcified at that point. So I was coming into all this weird tech debt from like the React class components and ways of kind of doing everything. And then Vite came out, and it was just so refreshing, because it was like, it was just simple. It was like so simple compared to what came before, and it was fast. So it was like, this is both better for my brain and it is better for my performance. It's like there's literally no drawbacks to using it. Nitro and the entire JS ecosystem is also very, that's Vue or Nuxt's framework, I think, was
Nuxt,
this
yeah.
stuff. Yeah, Nuxt.
Yeah. And that's the other piece that's really helped frameworks like SolidStart and SolidStart, which is like this ecosystem around Nitro, which is basically like, hey, we are building a meta framework, but we don't want to be like so closed about it. We are going to take every single piece that we can abstract out and make it its own package so that you can use it outside of Nuxt, outside of Nitro, wherever, however you want. And that's like it's Nuxt has a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of resources behind it. So all of these packages are very high quality. And then suddenly, if I'm building my own framework, all I need to do is to glue some of these packages together. Which is what like Vinci did, which glued like Nuxt and Nitro into kind of a newer, kind of like a higher level abstraction, so you can build your own frameworks.
Vinci,
I gave a talk.
I don't really know much about. This kind of came out right when I was paying less attention to like new stuff, especially in, like the Nuxt ecosystem. So what exactly is it?
Vinci, I gave a talk about it at React Rally, and I did a Learn with JSON episode on it. It's basically like, you can think of it as the meta framework builder, or like a meta framework, if that makes sense.
Because the meta framework builder was V, so it can't be the meta framework builder. It's got to be the meta framework builder. That makes actually perfect sense to me. Totally serious.
It's more like Vite was not a great meta framework build. It's like a better meta framework builder than Vite. It's like a layer on top of Vite that combines it with a server runtime. So the base concept in Vinci is a router, which is like, it's like, take a set of HTTP requests, and these set of HTTP requests will be handled by their own JavaScript application. That could be a server application, like it takes HTTP requests, or it could be a single page app, or it could be a static directory, basically. So you can say that, like, it's actually very kind of difficult to explain like this, but it basically like brings in the concept that you don't just have one Vite plugin pipeline. You don't just have one build, you have multiple builds. And this was not very easy to represent if you're just using Vite, because you're building this one build pipeline that has to process all the code and then try to like put it in multiple different places for different runtimes, or it has to do multiple passes through the pipeline, something like that. With Vinci, it's like you just define separate pipelines for separate things that you want to do, and it takes care of like things like file system routing. And
have you heard of this new React framework called
a little
One?
bit.
This sounds very similar to what you're describing.
Yeah, and the One is One is a React framework. It's a little different. One, like Vinci, is more of like a much different lower level tool that you can use to build your own frameworks. So SolidStart and SolidStart both use it. Nuxt and Analog are actually very similarly architected, and they like Nuxt or Analog. Like actually, Brandon Roberts built a version of Analog very quickly on top of Vinci, which is very nice. I gave a talk on like how you can use it to build your own framework, obviously. And one, like it very specifically, is the React framework around Tamagui and zero sync.
Yeah,
like we can do a whole different tangent on One.
Yeah, no, I don't necessarily want to go too deep down that rabbit hole. It was just I think it's cool because this is a thing again that with the Redwood Redwood router, we did a similar thing where you could first, it was always kind of client side, and then there would really be not necessarily like the same idea with routes, because you had your GraphQL server and you kind of just hit this big API in the back. But we then added in a pre-render like kind of directive So if you wanted to have a page just render on the server, you just put pre-render in. And then we eventually had like this kind of hybrid mode where you can switch between, pages that were on the front end or the back end and stuff. And I was always like, this is so cool. And I was always waiting for like other frameworks to do it. And then like now it's kind of blowing up. And I think it's very cool that you're super into this Vinci thing and that you did learn with Jason on, because I think this is like, it simplifies stuff so much to have your framework or your tool just have those things built in. Like it's really hard to fully like understand until you have it.
I mean, I don't know, I've thought about it multiple times to kind of just like actually try to build like a minimal React framework and put it out there. Hey, look, it's how easily you can do this. And I've been planning on it for a while. I definitely want to do it with WebSocket at least. Like, here's a real-time React framework that you can use just to like as a proof of concept. And at this point, I want to build ones to show off like what you can do with server functions and like how like you don't really need server components for a lot of full stack composition stuff that people keep talking about. So yeah, I might actually build a React framework, like at least a minimal React framework, just to make some points. But yeah,
well, I remember
again, it's because Vinci exists. Like if Vinci didn't exist, I wouldn't even think of building my own framework. Now I can do it over.
This reminds me of when Ben Holmes was kind of creating his own like React server component implementation as kind of like teaching exercises / just like showing how you could just do this yourself, because it's very empowering to have that lower level understanding of the framework, even if it is giving you that by itself. It's always really good to actually like have the confidence that you could re-implement it yourself if for some reason you had to.
I mean, hey, it got me a maintainer role in the TanStack router, TanStack Star Discord. So
that's cool. No, that's sweet, man. Yeah, you've totally kept up with the whole JavaScript web thing better than I have. I kind of stepped back from it because, and it got to a certain point where it's like I knew all of the frameworks, and I tried them all. I understood the trade-offs, and I'm just like, I'm kind of just sick of talking about it. But now it's been like a year since that, and now there's new stuff. So it's like, all right, cool. It's like actually new things now.
One thing I do want to mention before like moving on to a different topic is that SolidSocket, the project that won the Solid Hackathon, that's another thing that would not have been possible without Vinci and some of the things that it ships with. So that was very key to not just enabling me to build SolidSocket, but like giving me a lot of the underlying things so I don't have to build them myself. But yeah, I'm really curious about like what you've been doing for.
Yeah, I'll get that in a second. But who created Vinci?
Nikhil Saraf. He is one of the core team members. He has been like
also
a part of SolidStart team for a while.
Yeah. Okay. No, I remember. Yeah. I really wanted to get him onto my podcasts right when those started, when I kind of stopped doing them. Someone was like lining up, like, I gotta get this guy on the podcast because he was building such cool stuff.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. He gave a VeedConf talk last year called I Needed a Server, which kind of goes a lot more in the background context of his experience and where like kind of the motivation behind Vinci. So if Vinci is an interesting tool, then check out that talk.
Totally. So yeah, so what am I doing? I am building AI stuff, but still trying to keep it in the JavaScript world, because I don't know, you ever use Python? It freaking sucks, man. Holy crap.
I am a little bit, yeah. My girlfriend's doing her master's in business analytics, which means she's learning Python, and which means that I'm kind of also learning and like helping her around with like some Python concepts, programming concepts, assignments. So yeah. And like obviously the like a couple years ago, I was also helping out some friends with Python projects. So it's an inescapable part of or like any programmer's life at this point. It's like JavaScript. Like you cannot
Totally.
escape JavaScript, you cannot escape Python.
I'm doing my best, but I think for people who can just like use a Jupyter notebook, it's really nice.
Yeah.
And the
True. Yeah.
language itself is great. Like I got no problem with the actual language. It's just like once you get into
Mm-hmm.
package management, virtual environments, Python,
Yeah.
version management, like all this stuff that
Mm-hmm.
I kind of take for granted now in the JavaScript world because I've got
Yeah.
things like Volta and NPM, which has actually gotten pretty good. And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it's just a total nightmare. But anyway, this is a bit of a tangent. So I originally created this tool just for myself. So obviously I had a podcast for a very long time, and I'm just a content creator in many mediums. I've always had audio, video, text, and something I always struggled with was creating good transcripts for a lot of the, spoken content that I did. So the first piece of this was Whisper, which is OpenAI's open source transcription model, which is really, really good. And I started using that a lot in like end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And then when ChatGPT started coming out and getting really good, I started to realize that you could go at another level where you could take the transcript and generate things like high-level summaries of the episodes and even chapters with timestamps, because that was a thing that really can take a lot of time. Like you have to at least listen to the length of the episode to get the chapters. And then you have to write good descriptions. And I found that even though it wasn't perfect, it was good enough at finding the general shape of the different topics that it would require just minimal editing. So once I kind of realized that I could do this, and I could do it with both open source tools and just like any kind of off the shelf LLM you could find now, even like the free versions, I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. But that was a very manual process where I'd have to use Whisper to do the transcription. I would then write a prompt with the transcription. I would give it to ChatGPT, and then I would get the answer back. So I was like, okay, what if I create a Node.js CLI that lets you input a YouTube link or a podcast RSS feed, and it will then run transcription, take the transcript, append a prompt, feed the prompt and the transcript to an LLM, and then give the response and put it back in. Then you'd be able to generate all in one shot. And you almost could create like a whole web page based on an episode. Because I also had to do front matter by kind of pulling metadata from like the YouTubes or the RSS feed. And that's when I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. And then I started showing it to people.
Yeah, I'm sure podcasters will kill for this.
So after, I showed it to like 3 or 4 people, and every time they're like, dude, you need to like charge people for this. And
exactly.
Like, yeah. And so, it eventually kind of convinced me to not just build it, not just continue like have this open source thing, but I'm going to try and productize it now. And the idea being that it'll just be like a dashboard with input forms. So someone who doesn't know how to run Whisper and clone down a repo and, install your node dependencies and do all that kind of stuff can just, click and select, the LLMs they want to use, select different prompts, and then just like click a button and then wait, and then you get it back. And so that's going to be the tool. And I ran it on your thing. So your most recent episode, which was about the thing we've been talking about. So let me do that real quick. Let me see if I have the permissions to do this good. Okay, so
nice.
I'll read just kind of bits and pieces of this. So what I have it do, this is the default prompt. There's other prompts as well that you can select, but the default prompt gives you 3 things. It gives you a 1-sentence description, and I usually use this as the description field. Actually, so what I would usually do is I would do this. I would take this, and I'll put it here. So then you get as your metadata field, which is nice.
Which you could also automate, but
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the last things, because that part is harder to automate, because the LLMs will not always give you back the response in the right formatting. So you have to do some kind of regex thing to differentiate like the 1-sentence thing from the from the paragraph.
Couldn't you just like,
Go ahead.
I mean, these days, can't you just define a Zod schema? Like, here's the structure I want the response in.
From the LLM?
Yeah. Like, I know even OpenAI directly added this in their SDK that you can define a Zod schema, and OpenAI literally will give you a structured response.
That's true. Yeah. So if I was using structured outputs, which would have it give it to me in JSON, then I'll be able to do that. The problem is right now I'm just using the completion APIs. So I just hit it and I get a whole string of text back. So you're right. That's a very good point. And I just probably need to suck it up and build this in, because it would give me more control over the output I'm getting from it.
It's not as good. Yeah, that also makes sense. Like the more, like the structuring can, I guess, decrease the quality of the overall output. So maybe like that can
the
be
bigger problem actually is I have 7 LLM integrations. I integrate with OpenAI, Claude, Mistral, Gemini, Cohere. So all of them have a completion API, and they all work exactly the same because they all just copied OpenAI's thing.
Yeah, makes
so
sense.
That's nice, because then I have this really composable thing where I can switch out LLM services very, very easily. So once you start adding things like structured outputs, it's like, does Claude and Gemini have that? Are the APIs the same? Would I need to, maintain code for all those? So these are all the things I'm learning right now. I'm building all this AI crap, which is super fun.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it on top, like Vercel AI SDK does. Like Vercel's AI SDK, they allow you to talk to any LLM and pass an Azad schema for a structured output. It's the Vercel AI SDK, not V0. V0 is just their UI tool.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
And then
so that's also that's a good point. The issue with that is then you use this one thing and they manage the connections to all the things.
Yeah.
And I want lower level control, because I also want like I imagine this also can give you kind of insight into like what you're going to pay for one model versus another, but I don't really know if it. So
that's fair.
I just don't. I don't know how often I would have to.
Did I just see Bing? Yes,
down.
That is Bing.
What was that? Did I just see Bing? Oh yeah, no, because I'm using
Yeah, you just saw Bing.
Bing, but yeah, because I'm using Edge now, the Edge browser.
Nice.
Okay, so I was going to read some of this. So yeah, so you have your episode summary, which is then the longer one, and you have chapters, and
yeah, this is fantastic.
Totally. So
I mean, if we can analyze long form videos like that, it doesn't even have to be just like podcast. I guess like this analyzes the transcript, right? Not the visual content.
So yes, and that's the thing, is that for what I'm doing, I find usually just getting the transcript is pretty much good enough. Like if it's a really like code heavy kind of stream, that might be harder, because it would need more context into what's on the screen. That's kind of what I'm now thinking about, is do I want to now start integrating with like the image APIs and have it like, because you could have it to like take a screenshot every like 10 seconds or something like that,
Yeah, we definitely need these on Ryan's streams, because they are not super code heavy. They are very like, he tries to explain everything. So
that's funny actually you said that. What as I was originally first building this, it was around the same time when I was on his stream for my Redwood episode, which was a 5-hour stream. It was like 3 hours longer than any other stream I'd ever done. And that was the only stream I had out of all the ones I'd done that broke both Claude and OpenAI, because it was too long for the context window.
Makes sense.
After a couple months, the context windows got longer, so they became capable of handling a Ryan Carniato stream.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's also that he naturally breaks his stream into like sections as well, so you don't necessarily have to run it for the entire stream, even if like the context was smaller. But now that it's compatible, then yeah, it makes sense.
Well, it is nice to just get a high-level description of each section, because
Yeah.
usually when people do
Mhm.
chapters, they'll have a timestamp and then a chapter title. But this will
Yeah.
actually write you out like a one-sentence, one
Mhm.
paragraph description of what actually happens in the chapter, which
Yeah.
could be really nice because he covers so much material. So
Yeah.
yeah, I need, now that the tool is really built out, I need to go back and actually, because I could do this now, I can just run it on all of Ryan's streams and then just be
How
like,
much would
here you
that
go.
cost?
Okay, so that's another big question, is it depends on what
Right.
LLMs you use. So there's
Mhm.
so you have the 6 I mentioned, and then each of those
Yeah.
has like 5 to 10 models with all these
Yep.
trade-offs of cost and speed and whatever. Um,
Mhm.
I think that if you go with, so someone was saying Gemini is super cheap. I think if you go with
Mhm.
the best cheap models for ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, those are
Mhm.
probably going to give you a nice trade-off, because you could find
Yeah.
cheaper open source ones, but they're just not
Mhm.
as good. And like this makes, I
Right.
want there to be better open source models that we can use, and there are, but the issue is the open source models that are close to being as good are like 500 gigabytes, so you can't even actually run it locally. It kind of defeats
Yeah.
the whole purpose. So people
It's
end
like
up finding the
Llama.
models. Yeah, so Llama 405 billion parameters
Mhm.
is, kind of the biggest one. But like I'm on like a
Right.
fairly beefy, like 1-year-old M3 MacBook, and even still, it would require almost my entire hard drive to
Mhm.
use it. Like I didn't even,
Yeah.
I was like making sure I had enough memory and like, GPUs and stuff like that. But then I'm like, oh, I didn't realize I need a terabyte of storage just to save the model on my computer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is what I'm talking about. Things like
Like even being open
Sonnet
source.
or Haiku.
Yeah.
Those are the cheaper Claude
Mhm.
models, which are still pretty
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Yeah. Like even being open source, it would require at least one supercomputer.
Mhm. Yeah, so the way I kind of get around that is I also offer integrations with Grok, not the Twitter Grok. The
Mhm.
Grok, it's an infrastructure company, Together and
Got it.
Fireworks AI. And what they do is they run the open source
Mhm.
models on their own server and then give you an API endpoint,
Right.
which,
Got it.
yeah, it's kind of like, using a service to run a blockchain. It's like,
Mhm. Yeah.
it almost defeats the purpose, because you don't get to actually own the infra or your data, but you
Mhm.
also don't get something as good as the managed services. So you kind of get the
Yeah.
worst
As
of both worlds to a
optimized.
certain extent. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the one advantage is that you could really push a ton of tokens in and out for very cheap and very fast. So if you wanted to
Mhm.
process, like literally, if you had like 1,000 podcasts, because you've been podcasting since like, 2000s, it would be
Yeah.
probably good for that, like really, really bulk kind of data processing.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, he has been streaming for like 2 years, so and there's a like lot of 5 hour content. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
not like like if you've been podcasting for 2 decades, that's a whole different scale. Like
Yeah, I'm
like I
thinking
would
of
imagine like .NET
JavaScript
Rocks.
Jabber. Of
Yeah,
which one?
like .NET Rocks, which has existed for
Yeah.
almost 2 decades, like 200
Or
something episodes. I don't know.
Hanselman's podcast.
Yep.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. So I built this kind of for my own stuff, and then
Hmm.
I kind of got sidetracked and just started making it a product. I never actually finished running it on all of my podcasts and videos, because I ended up like kind of
Yeah.
running it on all of them, but then I didn't quite have my Astro site configured yet to have different content
Hmm.
collections, and then it just kind of fell by the
Hmm.
wayside. So that is something that I'm probably gonna do, because that was partly the idea, is I
Nice.
wanted good SEO for all of this content that I had out on
Hmm.
the internet,
Yeah.
but there's no real like text content for. All
Yeah.
right, hey, thanks for hanging out, man. Is this someone you know?
Yeah. Yeah. From Twitter.
from the tweeters.
From the tweeters,
So what do you do at your job? What is your company sell? What do you do?
my company sells us. So it's like a pimp for developers. More
So it's
more formally
consultancy
known as
or
consulting. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I
So
see.
through them, I'm currently working at keeps up to date in X. Yeah. So I'm currently working for a client, which is a healthcare company, building kind of their like next generation of customer member portal. I don't know if I can talk more than that, but yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always. I don't know at what point I came up with this analogy of like consulting company being like pimps, but yeah, essentially that's how I feel.
I would stop using that comparison. Like, don't say that.
Fair point. It's
Yeah.
funny. I care more about being funny than
I mean,
accurate.
I guess this is a question
Anyways.
of how good is your relationship with your boss and how good is his relationship with HR.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I don't even know who my boss is. Like technically my boss is I don't know. Like I've the problem with being in a consulting company is that I spend a lot more time with my client company than my actual employer. So
interesting.
Like
so
in the
how
last
did you first hear about this company and get involved in it? Like what was your foot in the door?
Technically the foot in the door was like lunch and learns that they used to host, or they still host, but they used to host in like back in Cincinnati when I used to live there. So I went there as a student many years ago. That's how I heard of the company. Then like there were some people from the company who taught at my college, my university. I invited a couple of them to like give some talks at our student meetups, and then like when I was looking for jobs, I saw one of the recruiters post on LinkedIn. I reached out to them. She connected with the people that I already knew from Smart Data or mutual connections. They gave like some pretty strong referrals in my favor. So company name is right here. Or technically website.
Are you writing Java? I see that they're only hiring Java and .NET developers.
Luckily, I am writing JavaScript and using Remix. So it's like one
That's
of
right.
the.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like usually in an enterprise environment, you don't get to do the things you like. You just get to maintain a bunch of legacy. But this is like nice in the sense that they have some greenfield projects where they're using Remix, and that's what they were kind of getting consultants for. That's what I lucked out on, like working on a Remix project.
This is perfect for you, and especially for where you are in your career, because like, you got to kind of live that startup life for a bit. And I think if you had kind of stayed at Clerk for like years and years and years, like it would have been great, I'm sure, and you would have like learned a bunch, but you would have been like doing something highly specific, which is like,
Right.
an auth third-party service. Whereas now I imagine you're seeing multiple different types of apps for different types of clients with different numbers of customers, different constraints. Like how many projects have you worked on since you started doing it? It's like you're just on like a couple things.
Right now, just one.
Just one, yeah. Okay.
Right now, just one. I mean, technically two if you count their like identity portal, the login service, which is like its own separate app. Which, but yeah, this is basically what I was doing before Clerk. Like before Clerk, for about like 3 years, I was this was kind of my job. Like I was working at this place where a lot of companies outsource projects. So
what don't
yeah,
I know? I don't understand these messages.
Yeah, me neither. But yeah, I mean, I totally get what you're saying, because that I did get to experience a lot of that when I was like before Clerk, when I was working at a similar place where there were a bunch of different projects. So I got to do React, I got to do Angular, I got to do PHP, I got to do like MongoDB, like kind of a bit of everything. some mobile apps with Ionic or PWA. A little bit of, I guess, was there any .NET there? Probably not. .NET was mostly like class projects, but yeah, it's definitely like a big diversity of projects. That said, there's a decent bit of diversity you can get at like startups like Clerk. Like I was a developer at Clerk, but even if I was an engineer, like something like Clerk has like its own auth service. And then it has a dashboard, then it has like a whole marketing site. So there's a decent bit of variety in terms of like what you're building at like any startup that's non-trivial at this point. So
Yeah, that's true. But you're still just usually
right,
it's a single like kind of product focus or business, or there's like a
yeah.
general thing that is
Mhm.
all encompassing. So okay, I get what they're saying
Yeah.
is that all of these are you work on things that people hate when you do these kind of stuff. There's something to that, but
True.
also if you don't, you would never use them otherwise if you weren't forced to.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I feel like I lucked out, because I work in an enterprise environment, but I'm also like working on a greenfield remix project, which is very nice. Although like I could be like 3 months from now, I'm like, hey, okay, you are assigned to a different project, or like our contract is entering, go work on this different project. And now I'm maintaining like a 6-year-old code base that was written by engineers who thought they were who thought they were very smart, implementing like a bunch of abstractions that did not stand the test of time, and now unnecessarily complicated code base, which is kind of like the code bases that I've written 3 years ago. So exactly, yeah, aka me 3 years ago. Exactly.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, as long as you're not having to work on COBOL apps, you're still doing pretty good.
I did have a friend who graduated college a year before me, who interviewed at a place, moved to Atlanta to work for them, was very excited. And then like a month or so into his job, they handed him a COBOL book and said, hey, this is what you're working on. Please learn COBOL.
Do you know Austin Krim?
I do not.
Yeah, he's I forget where he's working these days. He worked at Prisma for a little while. He's a buddy of mine from a while ago. He literally his first programming language was COBOL, and I had never met anyone
Nice.
who had ever said that before, especially someone who's like roughly my age. And I'm like, how the hell did that happen? He was like, my dad told me learn COBOL because all the COBOL developers are dying, because he was a COBOL. His dad was a COBOL developer, and had this insight into this because all the banking systems were written in COBOL and no one was learning it, and all the people were aging out. So he was just like, this would be a valuable thing. So he learned COBOL as like first program, and then like did COBOL jobs,
Nice. I mean, honestly, that's a great way to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And like even today,
Yeah,
around COVID, there was like a big demand and like a lot of pay for COBOL developers. I remember. I'm sure that's still the case.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. It was like there was like a specific New Jersey like government agency that was like, we need COBOL developers. And I feel like it kind of got blown into a bigger story than it probably was. But
that's fair.
Yeah, but I'll be curious these days. A good use case I think for LLMs and coding actually is just refactors, because like you could take a lot of COBOL code and port it in a way where most of it would turn out just fine for whatever language you would have to put it in. When you have to like build new features and it doesn't necessarily have enough context into your whole app, it can do weird stuff. But if you're literally just like taking hunks of code and being like, take this and put it in a language, here's a bunch of tests, make sure the tests pass. Like, I feel like it'd probably be easier these days to refactor a COBOL app to another language.
Yeah. There's actually a startup that's doing some work in this area, CodeMod. Like the founder, typical story, like worked at FAANG company like Facebook. Yeah, worked at a FAANG company, had great internal developer tools, got out of FAANG company, wanted those advanced developer tools for the rest of us and built a startup out of it. Same story that we see in NX and like a bunch of these other startups. So yeah, they're like building first like a code mod, kind of like a whole pipeline, and then using LLMs to generate the code mods, which means that your actual refactors or like code migrations are deterministic because they are like code mods, but AI helps you generate the code mods instead of doing the actual refactors, which I feel like is like a pretty good approach to this, like this whole
This is
strategy
why
of
you're
AI driven refactors.
this is why you're the GOAT, Dev, because you you tell me about things like this, which are the exact things that I want to know about, that I don't know about because I don't spend as much time just looking up new shit anymore. So thank you for doing all this work when I don't have the time to do it anymore. This is really cool. I'm going to check this out, actually.
Yeah, always willing. I'm hoping that like we can get one of these for Remix or Tanstack Start, and maybe like I know they have one for like Angular to React.
I was looking at the front
I
page
really want
and
to
I
see.
saw
Yeah,
it had like upgrade to React 19 was
yeah.
one. That's
They've
really
been
smart.
working with like framework developers on a lot of these. So like React 19, Next.js, Nuxt Vue, I think one of those. I always get those
Yeah,
confused.
React Router is probably like its own category because they do so many rewrites. They always got so much shit for it.
Yeah, it's great. And like now they're trying to make sure everything is backwards compatible. But yeah, they've had their own levels of pain.
Yeah, man. I remember when I was in my boot camp, there was always like the teachers would be talking about how they'd have to rewrite the React Router curriculum every time. And that was like the main thing that would be changing. And a lot of the other stuff they wouldn't have to really worry about. But there would be like, we'd be learning React Router 5. And they would be like, oh, with 4, I used to have to do it this way. And I was like, I don't have to learn all this crap.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Anything else you want to talk about before we start closing it out?
I want to hear more about the product that you're building, like where you're at. I guess like whatever you were talking about, and like you don't have to talk about like the things that are not built out yet or you want to keep in stealth mode.
No, I'm happy to talk about it for sure. So at first, the way I was developing it throughout most of the year, so I've been developing pretty much all throughout 2024, and the majority of that was spent just on creating a CLI, and that was like really, really good foundation for me because it allowed me to think very clearly about what did I want it to do. And every time I wanted to do a new thing, I would have to just build in a new flag. So once I kind of figured I had like this huge now set of things the CLI could do, basically you could run it on video or audio files. You can run them on local files or files on the internet. And then you can run on RSS, and you could process it in different ways. You can use different transcription services. You could use different LLMs. You could configure different prompts. And it kind of just like, it was very natural to just keep building out the features. Then I was like, okay, cool. So now I just have to take all that stuff, stick a node server in the front instead of Commander, which was the CLI framework I was using. And then most of that logic stays exactly the same. And you just have some endpoints instead of specific CLI commands. And you send, JSON with your key values that just does the stuff that your CLI would have done. Like instead of doing -- LLM ChatGPT, you would just like have a JSON object LLM : ChatGPT.
It's not a GraphQL endpoint. JSON.
Yeah, I bet at this point it would be pretty easy to stick a GraphQL endpoint on it, and I might just for old time's sake. But I use Fastify actually, which I'd never used before. But since it wasn't going to be just like a demo app, I didn't want to use Express, but I also didn't want to just build a straight up Node HTTP server. So I was like, Fastify felt like the right thing in that it's very established, it's been around for a while, it's well maintained, and that's kind of worked out well. Then the next step was just sticking like a UI on front where you have input fields that correspond to what the different CLI flags were. So that's kind of what I've done is I started with the CLI, then I built the server, and then I built the front end. Now though, the front end is just like a very, very basic form with some input fields and some like drop downs to kind of show you what all the different options are. And the hard part now is going to be like actually making a really good kind of like app experience, which is going to require having a dashboard, having a login, having some sort of payment service, because it's going to be like a product that people get paid for, because you have to pay for the LLM and transcription services, unless I want to like spin up my own servers that did the transcription and just like host Whisper and host like a local LLM, which I don't think really makes a lot of sense, mostly because the local LLMs just still aren't good enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have like a credit system where people can buy a certain amount of credits and then generate as much stuff as they want. And the credit amounts will be different for more expensive LLMs. So it'll cost more credits to use Claude 3.5 versus 3 Haiku and so on and so forth. So I'm now going to have to make a lot of like the payment thing is simple. So it's going to be Stripe, I'm sure. And the real question, which I haven't yet decided, is whether like what to do for auth, whether I want to use Clerk, whether I want to use one of these open source auth things. And so obviously I would be remiss not to ask a man who worked at an auth company. And should I use Clerk, or is there an open source thing? Because like what was Lucia, what was that one called? That one is now dead and was turned into a tutorial, which I think is kind of badass. Because he basically said, I don't think this framework should exist, so I'm going to delete it and put a tutorial that shows how to do auth yourself instead. Which I was like, what a baller move. So what's your thoughts on auth in 2025?
I mean, 10,000 MAUs is still a pretty big deal for like that Clerk offers. So I like no reason why not.
10,000 what?
10,000 like free monthly active users. That's still like a very high threshold. So I'm like,
sure, but an open source library,
it
would be infinite for free.
Fair, but it also won't be as good. And like Clerk's payment integration can't get here soon enough, honestly. Like, I'm just waiting. Like, I know we talked about it last year when we were at Render ATL that, hey, Clerk might have just built-in payments, so you don't even need to reach for Stripe APIs. You can just say Clerk, like ask Clerk for a certain amount, like charge this user this much money, and Clerk takes care of everything else. So I don't know, like there's been a lot of recent kind of like a new wave of open source tools like BetterAuth, and there's probably a couple more that I haven't really looked at, so I don't know how good exactly they are. I would definitely say that some like if you go back to like so I haven't really looked at these to say like how good they are. I would say that like the Clerk is a pretty good starting point, and you can always move to one of these open source solutions if you feel like you can't really afford Clerk at any point. And if you like really want to customize everything.
Yeah, I guess the question will probably be is, since I have like the Fastify server and an Astro front end, I'm gonna need to be managing auth on both. So I know Clerk has like an Astro integration, and then also has like a Fastify integration. So like, would I use both of those?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you only need, I think, the Astro integration if you never make like any direct request to the Fastify server, like from the client. Like if you're only talking to the Fastify server from the Astro server, then you don't need an auth layer there. at like on that level. You only need it in Astro then.
Yeah, well, so the app itself, you're going to be creating show notes, which will then be written to a database, which then you'll want to access, and the show notes should not be visible to other people. And so you could, I guess, if you authenticate on the client, then that would handle that, but you would still want a server-side check just in case, based on the limited amount of what I know about security.
Yeah. Now, yeah, that's what I mean. Like if you proxy them through Astro, like Astro Actions, so like your request goes to the Astro server first. That's where it gets authenticated, and then it goes to the Fastify server. So then the Fastify server doesn't need any authentication because you've already authenticated it on the Astro server. So you're using the Astro integration there.
Yeah, and this is the other question: is should I just get rid of the Fastify server and implement all the server-side logic in Astro? Yeah.
I definitely recommend that option. Like you already have a server, you don't need another one.
Yeah, I guess I just like having a decoupled headless backend also. And I guess you could still technically deploy the Astro server part as a decoupled thing.
Yeah,
I'll have to explore this because I've done a lot of Astro, but I've always just kind of had just like a blog with markdown pages. So I never really was using any of the server stuff. I never like would write like server kind of function code like I would in like Vercel functions and stuff like that. So I need to kind of explore that more and see what exactly that's like.
Yeah. I mean, Astro has pretty much everything that you would need, that you would want from Fastify. So it doesn't really, like, you don't really gain a lot by putting those endpoints into a separate Fastify server. Like they're all, I'm pretty sure Astro has like API endpoints, so it would be separate API endpoints exactly like you have it now. But they're like in the same code base, so you don't really need to split that out. And you could probably share types as well, much more easier.
I also saw you're using Bun earlier. Should I say screw it all and use Bun instead?
I'm only using Bun like as a replacement for npm.
Yeah.
So like it's Bun install, Bun run, Bun start thing. So like npm, it's replaced npm for me. It hasn't yet replaced like the Node.js runtime, and I don't know if it will.
Yeah, where I'm at with it is AutoShow. You can actually run AutoShow with Node, Dino, or Bun, but it's using Dino and Bun just running the Node compatibility layers, which like totally defeats the purpose because a lot of the performance benefits you would get from Bun is by using their native APIs. So I'd have to rewrite it anyway.
Yeah. And if you're using Bun, like if you want to go all in on Bun, then Elysia is like the best choice out there. Like it's fantastic framework. It's very, very fast. Fully takes advantage of Bun's own performance. And yeah, like I haven't tried it out yet, but I know like it's literally the fastest JavaScript server that you can run at this point.
Yeah, no, Bun is pretty tight. And I'm finally using TypeScript, which I was very reluctant to do for a long time. And that is pretty compelling.
Finally got there.
Yeah, that having Bun, I think just how you don't need things like TSX and stuff. That to me seems pretty nice.
Yeah. Now, I do use like Bun directly if I have like just some TypeScript files that I need to run, just to like test them out, some scripts, things like that. Very useful.
There's something I had wanted to ask
you.
I'm
really excited.
Like a year ago, I was thinking about having you come on do a stream about Effect. Is Effect even still a thing anymore?
Effect TS?
Yeah,
they raised a bunch of money as well too. And yeah, they're doing a lot of cool stuff. They raised some money to kind of build like a durable execution engine. So something like to run a bunch of node servers that like everything is handled concurrently and handled nicely between them, run like multi-step workflows. Basically, what if you've seen like Temporal build something like that for JavaScript. So
interesting. I did not think they were going to go in
LangPM.
that direction.
Yeah, durable execution. Hey, it's not BS. It's a very actually I don't know. It's durable execution is just like a nicer syntax on top of something that you would something that you would probably want to do anyways, but you would have to do like write a lot of painful logic for it. So it's like it's a whole tangent if we get into discussing durable execution. But yeah, that's what they raised money for. They're building that. FTS itself, I think it's doing pretty good. They recently started a podcast called Effect Cause and Effect. I think it's like only at their first episode. Yeah, I haven't gotten around to using it actually, but I've thought of like the frameworks that I'm building to build on top of Effect. I know it's like there's a pretty big barrier still on trying to adopt it because there's like a lot of things in there. Obviously, you don't have to use all of them to like in your project. You can just use one or two of the core things. But yeah, I just have to find some time to really dedicate to building something with Effect, getting a feel for it, and then maybe pitching it to like my work projects, my employers. Like, hey, this is something that we can and we should use.
Yeah, because my thoughts was like, if I'm going to do the TypeScript thing, I want to like do it right and get the full benefit. And it sounded like that would be good, just because it would give you like
for sure
more of like the end-to-end type stuff. But
yeah,
now I'm just gonna have an Astro project anyway. Like Astro is gonna handle the end-to-end type safety, right?
Yeah, and like end-to-end type safety is not really the big goal. It's more like when you go from regular JavaScript to TypeScript, there's kind of a level of like security that you feel knowing that there's a whole category of bugs that now are not going to exist just because like the compiler knows a lot more. It's kind of like a similar thing going from regular TypeScript to FTS, where suddenly the TypeScript compiler knows a lot more about how your code runs, not just what your data looks like. So there's now another category of bugs that are never going to exist. Like it has a similar hurdle, which like going from regular JavaScript to TypeScript, you have to learn the type syntax. You have to write your code slightly differently to make sure you're always you're doing type safe things. You have to know that how to rely on type inference. You have to like make sure you define your types and then share them. Like there is a learning curve, but once you get there, it actually makes you faster instead of slower. It's something similar with Effect, where it is going to slow you down a decent bit in the beginning as you figure out your way around things, but in the long run, it's always going to like reduce a category of bugs and give you that safety, which is where like now the compiler knows how your program executes, what it depends on, where things go wrong, like what errors can be thrown and how they're handled. And like if you go a level further and use their concurrency primitives, then like it can make things faster as well, because we don't normally handle concurrency that well. Not that like now if you're doing like multi-step AI workflows, that might be something that is valuable, but like for simple apps, that's not really valuable.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of what you were saying in terms of the things it was trying to solve and what it would give you is kind of like Lamb Dragon was, Aldo's thing, is that he had this, Rust thing that would give you insight into, like you say, where the code runs, and even into specific things like infrastructure and your AWS resources and all of that. And what you said about, the more upfront work and learning, but then greater type safety in the end. That was kind of what I got the sense of, just the little bit I had read about it. So yeah, I might check it out. I'd actually originally wanted to bring you on so that we could talk about types and stuff. We had a bunch of other stuff to talk about, but if you wanted to come on again in a couple of weeks, I would like to actually dig into
any point
how I've been typing the project, because I basically wrote it all in JavaScript. and then gave it all
Mm-hmm.
into Claude and ChatGPT and said, like, write my types. And that kind of got me to the point of having types that
Mm-hmm.
basically worked, but there's a couple of things that were kind of weird with them. And I've started to
Mm-hmm.
iron out some of those issues, but I feel like I need someone who actually knows how to think more holistically about how to type stuff. So that would be fun thing to do for another time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I try to do a lot of the type stuff like upfront because like you've probably heard of the phrase where like if you design good data structures, then the algorithms will kind of like just fall out of it. Uh, like when you were trying to like solve like CS problems. So it's kind of similar in that sense where like a lot of your type definitions can like better type definitions up front can make the rest of the work much easier. And the kind of flip flop where if you either don't try to design them, or if you have like a bad design, then for your data like your data types and things like that, then it actually just makes your job like 10x harder. So yeah,
No, I totally
always
get
happy to chat
I
about that
totally get
stuff.
that, because this is one of the pitches I would make for GraphQL, because you would start with your
Hmm.
schema, and then
Hmm.
a lot of things kind of spin out from that. And people always complain about how
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
so much overhead with GraphQL. You need to do all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, I mean, not really though. Like, not compared to writing TypeScript types. Like, a schema was very, very
Yeah.
narrowly defined in GraphQL. There's very few things you can put in that schema.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're an
Hmm.
experienced dev, it should take you like a week to learn how to write a GraphQL scheme. I never understood why people complained so much about that.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's a similar thing.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
actually,
in many
I do
ways.
know why people complained. People complained about GraphQL because the ecosystem of libraries, especially Prisma's libraries, even as much as I love Prisma,
Hmm.
they kind of made a whole mess of a lot of stuff. And Apollo also. Apollo and Prisma, they created all these open
Yeah.
source libraries. Some of them ended up being rewritten, some of them got dropped, some of them got
Hmm.
renamed, and it was
Yeah.
confusing as hell for everyone involved. But if you threw all that out and you just learned the
Hmm.
GraphQL spec, it was ridiculously simple, actually. Like, if you had to build your own GraphQL server from scratch, obviously that would be more challenging. But I'm saying, like, just writing the schema, writing your queries, like, all that
Hmm.
stuff actually was very, very simple. The problem is people tried to use all these things like Apollo and Prisma and
Hmm.
Nexus, and and then it's just everything was so confusing. But that was more of like an ecosystem
Yeah.
problem than like a GraphQL problem. Yeah, GraphQL Yoga is one of the things that helped
Hmm.
fix a lot of these issues. Actually, I remember when
Yeah.
Redwood integrated GraphQL Yoga because they dropped Apollo server, and it was like
Hmm.
the end of an era. It felt like in GraphQL. So I was like, Redwood's not using Apollo server finally.
Yeah. And then obviously there's things like relay, like which will give you every like
I never learned
and they'll
Relay.
solve like 20 problems for you, but it'll
Yeah,
be like 20 new things you have to learn.
I learned basically every single GraphQL library and framework except Relay. I never did a single thing with Relay because Relay it was all wrapped up in a lot of the old way of
Hmm.
doing React. Like, you would have React and Flux and Relay,
Yeah.
and that was like all worked together very, very well. But then people
Hmm.
started throwing out Flux and Redux, and then they would
Yeah.
have other ways of doing GraphQL, so it wasn't entirely clear when you would want Relay or when
Hmm.
you wouldn't. And yeah, that one was always confusing to me.
Yeah. I think at this point, like I still think React plus Relay is like kind of the ultimate stack for like front end apps, because like Relay has things that literally no one else has, and like everyone's trying to chase things that have existed in Relay forever, like the ability to just put your queries in your component and not cause like 20 spinners in a series to show up. Like
Yeah,
that's the
man.
primary thing that everyone's trying to solve, but no one is able to solve it because no one is using GraphQL, and you need GraphQL to
Bro,
solve it.
you have no idea how many times I said what you just said
Yeah.
about Redwood. People always
Yeah.
like talk about why they're like, oh yeah, Redwood's cool, but I'm not going to use it. And I'm like, you don't understand what it's giving you, and like how many things actually become much, much simpler if you
Hmm.
just take the GraphQL hit. So I don't know. I was kind of bummed when GraphQL kind of like quote unquote fell out of favor. Like obviously it hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
It's still used in lots of places, but
Mm-hmm.
at a certain point it was just like people who were like into new web dev stuff. They're just like, GraphQL is done. We're gone beyond GraphQL. I'm like, okay, bro.
Yeah,
Sure.
most of like my talks that I give, like because a lot of them are around full stack. Almost every time I have to add like at least one slide about. By the way, if you're using GraphQL, this talk doesn't really apply to you. You have like you're not facing these problems that I'm talking about. You can just use these tools and your life is fine. You in fact have a whole different category of problems of like how to implement GraphQL properly or how to write schemas, which is like I cannot tell you anything about.
Totally. Yeah, it's fun, man. All right, I think we'll call it here. This is a super fun conversation.
Awesome.
I'm really glad we got
Thanks,
to
Flo.
catch up. And
Yeah.
I'll try and keep in touch with you better. I fell out in terms like once I stopped doing as much stuff on Discord and X, I wasn't as good about keeping in touch with a lot of my dev friends. But I see your tweets all the time.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Actually, one like random quick question. What exactly happened to Edgeo?
They had 1,000 people not building anything. And someone realized at a certain point that that's not a good way to make money. Yeah, I mean, the problem with Edgeo is that like it was an amalgamation of 3 different companies, one of which was like a web deployment thing, one was a video streaming service, and one was like a security thing. And they never really coalesced into a product that was actually compelling enough to get people to switch off of Cloudflare or Akamai. And so even though we could have, better performance stats or, whatever, that just was kind of an uphill battle. And, it was just a classic case of a large enterprise tech company with a lot of bloat. Like there was one point where like the entire company, every single person stopped doing any work whatsoever. So we had to spend a month migrating from Slack to Microsoft Teams. And it's just like the amount of work it took to do that. It could not have possibly been worth the money we were spending on Slack. There's just no chance, So just stuff like that. And, there's lots of different layers of silos. So I never knew what the hell anyone in the company was doing, even though I was like the DevRel person. And I was running this community effort, but we never had a clear path of how to get the community effort to pay dividends for Edgeo. So at a certain point, they dropped JavaScript Jam, and they just were like, "Hey, you can now do security stuff." And I'm like, I don't know anything about security. Like, the hell am I gonna do about like security stuff, And so I kind of saw the writing on the wall and quit in March of this year, and then they declared bankruptcy like a couple months ago. So they're gonna be like, I think, broken down, sold off for parts, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I saw that tweet about the bankruptcy. That was fun.
Yeah, and I'm especially salty because I asked them if they wanted to just like sell off JavaScript Jam or just like let me take it over. And I told them I would keep doing it for free. And they were like, no, we want to hold on to it because it's like our company IP. And then they just did nothing with it. And now the domain is expired. And all the shit that I wrote and all the content I created now are all dead links. And I'm just like, fucking A, man. It's so frustrating.
Like even the recordings?
So the recordings are still up on the Transistor site, but the Transistor site I don't have access to anymore. So at a certain point, even that's going to lapse, I think, because that needs to be a paid service. So all of the stuff is still on the web archive. So what I might end up doing, if I'm going to try and buy the domain because it expires in 2 months. So I'm going to see if I can just buy javascriptjam.com, and then it would be fine. But if not, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to like rehost it all just on ajcwebdev.com.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's a real shame. Well, good to know. Thanks for the quick exposition there. I was curious.
Yeah, it was a learning experience for me for sure. Because when I got
Hmm.
the job, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be working for this like big tech company. It's like publicly traded and has all these big
Yeah.
customers and job security, and it's just like not how it went at all. It was like
Hmm.
far more unstable and less job security than I had at like 10 and 100-person startups that I was working at before.
Hmm.
So I'm
Yeah.
glad that I went through the process, so I learned a bunch, and it also then put me in a position where I kind of had to figure out what I wanted to do for
Hmm.
my own thing. Because I've always wanted to not have to have a boss or like work for a company, but I had to just to
Yeah.
make money at a point because I was like learning to code at the same time that I was trying
Hmm.
to get a job. So, it would have made sense for me to build a product 3 or 4 years ago. So I've had no freaking clue how to do it. So now that I have some, skills, I've worked at a lot of companies. I'm like, okay,
Hmm.
now is the time for me to see if I can like just bootstrap a basic indie hacker thing and just like make enough to
Yep.
cover my own, expenses. And
Yeah.
then I really think that that is going to be the way to go because then I can slowly build it over time, however I want. And
Hmm.
I wouldn't be opposed to taking VC money at some point in my life to build some sort of product, but I want to first try and just bootstrap something myself because I'm not trying to build like a hyperscaler kind of company, and make billions. I just want to like have tech that is useful, that I have full autonomy over, and that I can make like a decent living
Yep.
at.
Yeah. That makes sense. This is something I wanted to do for a while, but like at least up until like my education loans are not paid off, I just cannot think of it. So until then, it has to be like I need some sort of stable income, and I need to be able to live in this country to be continue to make stable income. And then once like maybe like my loans are paid off and maybe my partner is also making money, so I can be less reliant on my income, I'll be like, okay, now time to take a break, do some open source work or build some indie products.
Yeah, you just gotta think about what can you build that would give value to people.
Yeah, that's also like that's something that scares me. I'm like, I don't want to do business. I don't particularly like doing business. Building a product is like a is doing business basically. I'd much rather like just solve technical problems like solid socket. Like, hey, here's a technical capability that I think that we should have. Can I build that? If you ask me like if I can I sell it, I'm like, hell no. I don't have. Yeah, signals on the server is what I wanted to build. That's it. I have no idea how to sell it or how to make something that sells.
So what you're saying is you're a classic tech nerd.
Pretty much, yeah.
Have you
I mean,
watched
I'm
Silicon Valley,
hoping
the
that I
TV show?
can build. I have not. I have not. I need to watch it. I
Okay.
keep hearing
I'm
references that
sure
I
I'm
don't
sure lots of
understand.
people I'm sure lots of people have told you to watch it, so I don't need to belabor the point.
Yep.
But it is so well done and illuminates so many things about Silicon Valley. And the founder, he builds this like compression algorithm, and he is like the biggest nerd ever and doesn't understand anything about business, doesn't know anything about people. He's just like
Right.
straight up autistic as fuck kind of dude. And it just
It's
has
not like
lots of
Ron
really
Carniato.
totally. Yeah, no, really. Except like even like imagine Ryan Carniato, but also doesn't have people skills or communication skills.
Right. That's yeah,
Yeah,
makes sense. So
yeah.
me.
Dude, you clearly got communication skills. I mean, you're most known for tweeting. Let's be honest here.
That's fair, yeah. But it's a recent thing. If you had known me 4 years ago, you wouldn't have you wouldn't have said that I have communication skills. Like literally
Yeah,
four
well,
years ago, not even that long ago.
I knew you 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, I get okay. Yeah, I need to watch that show.
All
Cool.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks a lot for
We
having
could
me
we
on.
could keep going, but I'll call it here. Just
Yeah.
stay on for a second
I
after we end it.
also
Thank you
yeah, I need to
everyone
start
in the
packing up.
crowd.
I need to
Yeah.
yeah.
And
See ya.
people saw your Twitter handle and your company, so we don't need to kind of do
Yep.
any of that. All right, bye everyone.